It weren't rocket-firing typhoons that destroyed most German tanks, nor was it the hidden mine or the Piat ambush. It were guns, mounted in tanks, self-propelled and emplaced, that claimed the bulk of German tanks through direct, armor-piercing gunfire, often at short range and at short notice. Key among these was the 17-pounder, the only gun in the British arsenal powerful enough to deal with Germany's latest tanks. Getting the heavy 17-pounder forward at the right time and place was best done through a deliberate shuffle. First, 17-pounder armed tanks led the attack, followed by self-propelled guns to consolidate the objective until towed 17-pounders were emplaced. In Normandy, this tactic enabled steady advances despite incessant German counterattacks with heavily armored tanks. But if things went wrong and these scarce 17-pounders were misplaced at a critical time, British forces found themselves dangerously undergunned. This episode of Teaching Tactics covers the 17-pounder in detail, focusing in particular on its offensive use during the attack and consolidation as part of the combined arms team. The first part looks at the capabilities of Britain's anti-tank guns, the distinct roles of tank, self-propelled and towed configurations, their layered organization alongside other anti-tank weapons, and finally, the available means of communication. The second part then shows the tactic in action, based on training manuals, after-action reports and eyewitness accounts. Note that the term British is used as shorthand for all forces that used British equipment and doctrine regardless of nationality. As anti-tank tactics and equipment are in a constant state of change, it should also be noted that the specific period under consideration is limited to the Western Front from June to September 1944. You're watching Digital Battlefield Tours and this is Teaching Tactics. The key metric of an anti-tank gun is its armor penetration. This is a complex subject, however, with endless variables and no simple yes or no answers when it comes to actual field conditions. So, the following segment will use theoretical data to compare the three most common guns in the British arsenal at the time of the Normandy campaign. Their performance will be measured against the 100mm Vic visor plate of the German Tiger I heavy tank, struck directly head-on at 750 meters using standard armor-piercing capped, ballistic-capped ammunition. The purpose is not to give a comprehensive analysis of which gun could actually destroy a Tiger in the field, but merely to illustrate their comparative performance against a theoretical benchmark. All measurements have been converted to metric for the sake of consistency. Note that pounder is a naming convention, not a strict unit of measurement. Starting with the 6-pounder, this towed anti-tank gun had somewhat belatedly replaced the pre-war 2-pounder in 1942 and proved its worth in North Africa against older German tanks. Its 57mm projectile weighed only 3.3 kilograms and left the barrel going 830 meters a second, giving it a potential penetration just shy of 100mm. This made it ineffective against the Tiger's visor plate unless it was struck almost perfectly head-on within 400 meters. The 6-pounder was also intended as Britain's next tank gun, but combat experience in North Africa caused a shift in armored doctrine that leads us to the next weapon. The 75mm dual-purpose gun was introduced in American Lend-Lease tanks in early 1942. Its powerful high-explosive shell was so popular with British tankers that a similar weapon was installed on the Cromwell and Churchill, making it the backbone of British tank firepower by 1944. Lobbing a heavy projectile from a fairly short barrel came at the cost of velocity, limiting its armor-piercing performance compared to the 6-pounder. The 75mm projectile weighed a hefty 6.5 kilograms and left the barrel going only 619 meters a second, giving it a theoretical armor penetration of less than 80mm, making a frontal shootout with the Tiger utterly hopeless no matter the range. The British already recognized the need for a heavy, future-proof AT gun in 1941, but it took until early 1943 for the brand new 17-pounder to first see action. Its 76.2mm projectile weighed 7.7 kilograms and left the barrel going 884 meters a second, giving it a theoretical armor penetration exceeding 150 millimeters. This was more than enough to punch through the front of the Tiger well beyond a kilometer, even at a 30-degree impact angle. The armor penetration of both the 17-pounder and 6-pounder, but not the 75mm, could be significantly increased by using armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition, but this experimental round was only available in limited numbers and wasn't properly covered in training during the period under consideration, meaning its practical utility was reduced by poor reliability, limited availability, and user error. For these reasons, it has not been taken into consideration. Having established the clear and decisive performance gap between the 17-pounder and the majority of older weapons, the next issue is bringing this heavy gun into battle. Mobility is as decisive as firepower in defining the role of an AT weapon, while protection, both in the form of armor and ease of concealment, dictates the aggression with which the piece can be brought into action. When British forces landed in Normandy, they brought with them 3 ways of fielding the 17-pounder, each with distinct advantages and disadvantages. The simplest was on a towed carriage. These relied on an artillery tractor for mobility and concealment for protection. Towed guns couldn't be used offensively, but had to be carefully emplaced out of view of the enemy and wait for tanks to drive into their field of fire. Once discovered, they lacked the mobility to reposition and were vulnerable to almost all enemy weapons, the thin shields being splinter-proof at best. These characteristics favored smaller guns, such as the 6-pounder, which could be manhandled short distances and were easier to dig in and conceal. Finding a suitable towing vehicle was also easier. In the case of the 6-pounder, the ubiquitous Lloyd and Universal carriers both sufficed as off-road capable, lightly armored tractors. By contrast, the 17-pounder's weight of nearly 3 tons and overall height of 160 centimeters made it almost impossible to manhandle and required space and time to emplace, let alone dig in and camouflage, which could take up to 12 hours. When it was finally sighted, the heavy muzzle blast threw up dust that blinded the crew and instantly gave away its position, significantly reducing both its effectiveness and survivability after the opening shot. To make matters worse, Britain lacked a suitable artillery tractor for bringing a gun of its size into action. The most common towing vehicle was the C8 Field Artillery Tractor, the FAT, but this large and unarmored vehicle was extremely vulnerable near the front line. Despite its 4-wheel drive, its off-road performance was poor, especially when towing a heavy 17-pounder. Some batteries were given American half-tracks as gun tractors, while others used outdated turretless Crusader tanks, but neither of these could make the towed gun a truly mobile weapon. Quickly moving a 17-pounder, not just cross-country, but actually into and out of a firing position, required a proper self-propelled mount. Britain had gained some positive experience with self-propelled guns, or SPGs for short, in North Africa, but these took the form of light AT guns carried on lorries with only a limited reverse. It wasn't until mid-1943 that the American M10 gave the British a tracked and armored SPG capable of mounting the 17-pounder in a fully rotating turret. While fitting the British gun was fairly easy, lack of 17-pounders meant that some M10s were used in their original configuration with the weaker American 3-inch gun. The M10 was designed to suit the aggressive American tank destroyer doctrine and superficially resemble a tank, but British manuals explicitly stated that the M10 was not a tank and should not be used as one. Instead, the SPG in general was seen as an anti-tank gun that could drive itself into a temporary firing position before driving off again to avoid return fire, using mobility instead of concealment to achieve surprise. Its high profile and noisy engine made it a conspicuous target that was not easily dug in or camouflaged, meaning it shouldn't remain static like an emplaced gun. On the other hand, its light armor and open-topped turret meant it also shouldn't go on the offensive to seek out enemy tanks. Actually taking firepower up to the enemy was the job of the tank, which brings us to the final mount. Britain fielded 2 tanks armed with the 17-pounder during the Second World War, these being the Firefly modification of the American Sherman and the Challenger based on the Cromwell, while no 17-pounder variant of the heavy Churchill saw action. Both 17-pounder tanks were intended as so-called hole punchers that supplemented the regular tanks at a 1:4 ratio. Compared to the more independent SPG, the role of the 17-pounder tanks was restricted to being a specialist anti-tank escort that accompanied the regular tanks while these used their 75mm guns against more numerous unarmored targets. This meant they usually didn't go out of their way to hunt for enemy tanks, but only engaged them if they interfered with the unit's mission. Taking the Sherman Firefly as an example, it boasted identical firepower to the M10 except for the addition of a coaxial machine gun and a comparable level of mobility due to similar automotive performance and overall weight. The real difference, at least on paper, was in the level of protection, most notably the Firefly's fully enclosed turret and thicker plates. In practice, however, the difference in armor thickness was largely irrelevant when facing powerful German 75 and 88mm anti-tank guns. These cut through a Firefly just as easily as an M10, especially the 51mm glacis plate that shielded most of the Firefly's front. Both vehicles also shared the high profile of the Sherman chassis, with the M10 actually being slightly higher overall due to the 50 caliber machine gun that was usually omitted from the Firefly. The poor visibility from the Firefly's closed turret forced British tank commanders to observe from an open hatch and face the same dangers as the M10's exposed crew. Meanwhile, the open-top turret of the M10 was partially remedied by installing armored roofs, a Normandy field modification that eventually became a design requirement for future British SPGs. In practice, this meant that the technical capabilities of the M10 and Firefly had largely converged around being conspicuous, lightly armored but decently mobile 17-pounder carriers. The key difference wasn't their technical capabilities, however, but their tactics and organization, which brings us to the next chapter. The organization of anti-tank weapons is notoriously difficult to pin down, as it is constantly adapting to new equipment, both friendly and enemy. To avoid going over endless exceptions and variations, the following example is based on British 30 Corps prior to Operation Market Garden. While not exhaustive, this formation still provides a solid reference that includes most types of anti-tank units. Before diving in, it should be noted that the various arms used different names for units of the same size. While everyone agrees on corps, divisions and brigades, below that there are some battalion-sized units that are referred to as regiments. A level lower, you have infantry companies, artillery batteries and armored squadrons. Below that, the infantry uses platoons, while both the artillery and armor use troops for units of similar size. Starting with the Royal Artillery, this was the primary anti-tank arm of the British Army in the Second World War, fielding a variety of dedicated anti-tank regiments. 4 different types can be seen in this overview. 1 independent corps-level unit, 1 organic to the armored division, 1 to the regular infantry division, and 1 to the so-called assault infantry division. All these AT regiments shared the same basic structure of 4 batteries consisting of 3 troops, each fielding 4 guns, for a total of 48 guns throughout the regiment. The main difference was the type of guns and mounts they fielded. The least mobile of the regiments was the one under the regular infantry division. It fielded 16 towed 6-pounders and 32 towed 17-pounders in mixed batteries that were usually parceled out to the division's infantry brigades. The 17-pounders were all towed by the field artillery tractor, making them mostly road-bound. A small number of SPGs was used by the AT Regiment of the Assault Division, which was an infantry division that had landed on the beaches of Normandy in the first wave. Its AT Regiment fielded 16 M10s with the original 3-inch gun in addition to 32 towed 6-pounders. The reasoning behind this mix was that only tracked vehicles could reliably move through wet sand, and the mobile firepower of the M10s would help consolidate the initial beachhead. This small proportion of SPGs in an infantry division proved highly successful and was eventually standardized when availability improved later in 1944. The largest allocation of SPGs was found in the AT Regiment of the Armored Division, which required a high level of mobility to keep up with the rest of the formation. 2 of the 4 batteries fielded the M10 for a total of 24 SPGs, but only about half mounted the 17-pounder, while the rest still used the American 3-inch gun. As the war progressed, more 17-pounders became available, and the 3-inch was gradually phased out for the sake of commonality and improved performance. The remaining 2 batteries used a total of 24 17-pounders towed by M14 half-tracks. Finally, the corps-level AT Regiment was almost identical to the one in the Armored Division, but used the Crusader as a gun tractor for its towed batteries. This regiment functioned as a fast-moving and hard-hitting corps anti-tank reserve, requiring a large allocation of SPGs. Its towed batteries generally served as a backstop in vulnerable areas. That covers the Royal Artillery for a total of 64 SPGs, 80 towed 17-pounders and 48 towed 6-pounders. The small number of 6-pounders is deceiving because by 1944 this gun had largely been handed down to non-artillery units. The most numerous of these were the 21 regular infantry battalions found throughout the Corps, each with an organic platoon of 6 towed 6-pounder guns. Additionally, the Motor Battalion of the Armored Division fielded 12 towed 6-pounders, and the reconnaissance regiments of the infantry divisions each had a platoon of 8. Unlike the artillery AT guns that were moved around where needed, the organic 6-pounders remained with their battalions to ensure constant protection against tanks. Below the battalion level, the Piat man-portable anti-tank grenade launcher provided small unit defense against enemy armor. Its penetration of around 100 mm put it roughly on par with the 6-pounder, but the Piat's range was limited to just 100 meters. Finally, tank-mounted 17-pounders of the Royal Armoured Corps are found in the Armoured Division. Its 3 armoured regiments and single armoured reconnaissance regiment each fielded 12 modified 17-pounder tanks. In the regular armoured regiments, these were Fireflies to accompany the Shermans, and in the Recce regiment they were Challengers to back up the Cromwells. The 75mm armed tanks outnumbered the 17-pounders more than 3 to 1, for a total of 190 regular tanks and 48 hole punchers organic to the Armored Division. Additional tanks could be attached to the Corps in the form of independent brigades of 3 armored regiments and a motor battalion. A tank brigade fielded Churchills without any 17-pounders, but an armored brigade fielded Shermans with the usual 1-in-4 proportion of Fireflies, potentially adding 36 additional 17-pounders for a Corps total of 84 tanks armed with 17-pounder guns, 80 towed 17-pounders and 64 SPGs, of which about half mounted the 17-pounder. To explain the tactical cooperation of these weapons in more detail, the following units will be picked as demonstration forces. 1 infantry battalion from the regular infantry division, supported by 1 troop of towed 17-pounders from its divisional AT regiment. 1 squadron of Shermans from the independent armored brigade, and 2 troops of 17-pounder SPGs from the Corps AT regiment. Before moving on to the tactics, there is one more important technical specification to discuss. Previously, we've covered the firepower, mobility and protection of Britain's anti-tank weapons, but now we must consider the missing link by looking at communications. The infantry battalion commander in charge of the upcoming action primarily relies on wireless communications to control his forces during the attack, but radio technology still had some major limitations by 1944 that impacted some weapons more than others. Worst off was the battalion's own 6-pounder platoon, which had no organic radio at all, severely limiting the flexibility with which its guns could be brought into action. The most reliable way to ensure close cooperation with the infantry was splitting the platoon in 3 sections of 2 guns and subordinating these to the leading rifle companies. The company commanders had a direct wireless link to battalion thanks to man-portable radios. The towed 17-pounder troop from the divisional AT regiment was little better, with just one radio, meaning its 4 guns could only be controlled as a single unit when they were formed up under the direct control of the troop leader. Once dispersed into firing positions, control of individual guns relied on messengers until telephone wire could be laid. By contrast, each SPG was outfitted with a radio, giving them a level of control matched only by the tanks. Here the limiting factor was netting, as the radios could only tune to one frequency at a time and multiple messages could not be sent on the same frequency simultaneously. As netting too many radios to the same frequency overcrowds the net, units were instead netted onto their own frequency controlled by their commander, who used a second radio set to communicate with higher command on a separate net. In practical terms, this meant an SPG couldn't just radio a nearby tank, but had to request information through his commander, which took time, especially in combat when the nets were busy. The SPGs could talk to each other on their own battery net, but here an issue was that the two troops might be fighting separate actions simultaneously, risking a communications jam if both wanted to send messages at the same time. Lastly, each tank and SPG was connected to a secondary troop-level net, but this so-called B set had a short range and poor reliability compared to the more powerful A set that connected the batteries and squadrons. All this meant that the vitally important coordination between the different anti-tank weapons, especially the towed guns, was difficult, if not impossible, to improvise by radio. Instead, the routes, the primary and secondary positions, and the fields of fire of each individual gun had to be planned out in advance on a map, and pre-assigned rendezvous points and foolproof signals, not wireless micromanagement, had to ensure that these positions were reached without delay. Achieving such close coordination demanded strict control under a single overall commander. In this case, the major of the SPG battery is the senior anti-tank specialist, so he is given the task of organizing all anti-tank weapons. This job also includes coordinating with the tank squadron and infantry sappers. The latter are especially important for clearing roads for the towed guns and placing minefields and anti-tank obstacles. Last but not least, the major must prepare to unambiguously hand over responsibility of the sector to the captain of the infantry anti-tank platoon, who will be left in charge of the battalion's anti-tank defenses after the tanks and SPGs have played their part. That concludes the theory from muzzle velocities to millimeters, cores and communications. The next part on tactics will show the 17-pounder shuffle in action. The following demonstration is based on official manuals dealing with tank and anti-tank tactics, supplemented by combat experience sourced from war diaries, after-action reports, memoirs and interviews. The overall situation is based on a battle drill from Artillery Training Pamphlet number 9, but it remains a fictional example designed for educational purposes, not a reconstruction of any particular battle. When actual combat experiences are included, the date, place, unit and source will be clearly stated. Moving on to the situation, our objective is a small village located on a spur. There is low ground in front and on the flanks and a wooded hill behind it. A cluster of orchards serves as our forming up place, the FUP. The ground between it and the objective mainly consists of open fields lined with thick hedgerows. The village to our left is lightly held by friendly forces, but the village on the right is occupied by the enemy. We don't have the forces to attack it simultaneously, so part of the challenge is to cover both flanks, especially the right, as we advance into the center village. The enemy forces are from an understrength German armored division. The front line is lightly held by infantry, with about a company's worth of troops estimated in the village with hastily established defenses. No minefields or anti-tank guns have been located, but enemy tanks, including Tigers, are known to be in reserve nearby. Multiple roads lead into the village from the enemy rear, allowing for rapid armored reinforcements to be brought up once we commit to our attack. Based on the terrain, the threat of enemy tank attack and the available anti-tank weapons, the following plan is created. A company with 1st Troop and B company with 2nd Troop jump off from the start line just beyond the FUP and advance line abreast into the village behind a creeping barrage laid out by the divisional artillery. At the same time, a smokescreen will be put down on the right flank to blind the enemy defenses there. C company with 3rd Troop follows closely behind B company to secure the long right flank. The objective is the far edge of the village, where the infantry will occupy pre-assigned company sectors and switch to a defensive footing. Each attacking company has a section of 6-pounder guns under command for immediate defense of their allotted sector. D company and 4th Troop will remain at the FUP in reserve. The 2 SPG troops will start as a flank guard and advance slightly behind the lead companies. Both troops are escorted by a section of carriers from the infantry battalion to protect against enemy infantry. As soon as the objective is reached, H Troop on the left will relieve the tanks on the far side of the village, while G Troop will cover the right flank. Once the SPGs have taken over, the tanks will return to their forward rally at the FUP to act as a mobile reserve during the consolidation. Meanwhile, the troop of towed 17-pounders will be emplaced and providing security at the FUP throughout the initial stages of the attack, then move into the objective once the tanks return. As soon as all towed guns are sighted on the objective, the SPGs fall back and swap places with the tanks at the FUP, allowing the tanks to fully disengage and completing the shuffle. The attack is scheduled to start after midday with the intention of seizing the village by last light and consolidating under the cover of darkness. This will force the Germans to launch a hasty counterattack at night when their tanks are at a disadvantage, or wait until the following morning, giving the British more time to dig in. The artillery commences its creeping barrage and the first wave of tanks and infantry set off from the start line. The tank troops advance with the regular tanks in front, engaging suspected enemy positions with HE and machine gun fire, covered by the Fireflies from the rear. The infantry advances under the suppressive fire and clears the first German outposts. On the left, 1st Troop with A company is bounding from hedgerow to hedgerow when they are met by incoming high-velocity rounds. At the edge of the village, about 600 meters away and slightly elevated, Panzer IV tanks are spotted. Lieutenant Render of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry found himself in a 75mm Sherman facing a similar situation during the attack on Rouret on the 26th of June. He didn't have a Firefly in his troop, however, because his squadron leader preferred having them under his direct command in a separate troop. To quote Lieutenant Render, "I have absolutely no idea where the first enemy tank round came from, but we were closing in on the outskirts of the village that lay less than 1,000 yards away. The Germans used a propellant that had a lower flash base to it, which made the flash of their muzzle blast difficult to spot, especially if they were dug in among trees or buildings. I scanned left to right across the houses and vegetation to my front as another high-velocity crack, followed by another, announced that more rounds were being sent out to greet us. The troop on the left was already returning fire as incoming high-velocity projectiles plowed themselves deep into the ground around us. My squadron commander was calm on the net, calling out that we had enemy armor to our front and bringing the other troops up to support us. Firing into the sun made it more difficult for the German tanks to pick us up in their sights, and the weight of fire from the squadron was also affecting their aim. Then I saw a glint of light on metal that drew my eye to the low, hull-down shape of a Panzer. I gave a fire control order over the intercom. AP, traverse right, 800 yards, enemy Hornet, dug into the right side of prominent building. My gunner, Martin, clenched his spade grip and the turret swung round, but he traversed beyond the aiming point. I shouted a correction and he traversed back again, desperately seeking the target. I heard the retort of a 75mm firing to my left. Corporal Lane was already engaging the enemy tank I had spotted. Normally, the gunner screams "on" when he is locked onto the target indicated, but Martin had still not located the enemy through the gunner's sight. I hauled him backwards, pulling him out of his seat. Squeezing into his vacant spot, I grabbed the spade grip and brought the gun to bear. Tapping the firing pedal an instant later, our first round splashed to the right of the Panther. Shoving Martin back into his seat, I thrust my head back out of the turret and shouted the adjustment to the fall of shot. This time, Martin had got him. He made the correction for line and direction, and I watched the trace of the next AP round accelerating towards the German tank. We were hitting him now, and so was Lane, and our combined weight of fire forced him to withdraw. During the same action, another troop leader, Lieutenant Hills, also engaged a Panzer IV with his 75mm gun. To quote, "The first shot bounced once before hitting the Panzer. There was a plume of blue smoke from its exhaust as it lurched into reverse and stalled. It started to move again, and a second shot hit it as it disappeared into the wood. The shots would not have penetrated, but they might have damaged the track. This was my first tank-to-tank engagement, and it had not been as conclusive as I might have wished." In our case, the Panzers also missed their opening volley due to being hastily committed to an unfamiliar situation, having the setting sun in their eyes and being knocked about by the creeping barrage. Shelling was unlikely to outright destroy tanks, but it forced the commanders to close down, damaged radios and optics, and kicked up dust, reducing their situational awareness. However, the Sherman's 75mm guns lacked the power to decisively knock out the Panzer IVs at this range, and the German tanks quickly disengage before a Firefly can bring its 17-pounder into action. Let's introduce a worst-case scenario. The duel with the Panzer IVs, while successful, took time. Enough time that the artillery barrage has lifted and the dust clouds are clearing. In the meantime, a German Tiger has taken up position on the wooded hill overlooking the village, giving it just enough clearance to fire over the roofs and treetops into First Troop as it continues its advance. At roughly 1 kilometer, the Tiger's 88 is in its element and the troop is wiped out. A similar situation befell the 2nd 5 and 4 Yeomanry near Bursy on the 7th of August, when Tigers used high ground to snipe 5 tanks of its A Squadron from long range. The B Squadron commander took the initiative and, after quickly studying the map, led one of his troops on a Tiger hunt, personally commanding the action from the Firefly. His driver recalled the action. We went round and crossed several open bits of ground, and we saw some German infantry and they were mostly running away. I stuck the nose of my tank into this hedge and the gun was just above it, sighted on the Tiger up on the hill. We got on right round on the side of it. The thing was coming out of the emplacement. All I saw was a flash when my gunner fired. 3 rounds, I think he fired, quickly, one after the other. My loader must have been on his game, he loaded quite fast. Anyway, the shots went home. Apparently we knocked out the Tiger. By the time we fired the 3rd shot, it was a question of getting out as quickly as possible. The 17-pounder flash was so obvious. The commander had told him to engage the reverse gear once the Firefly was in its firing position, and as soon as the 3rd round left the barrel, the driver flung the tank back into safety, leaving the Tiger burning on the hill. In our case, the dismounted survivors of 1st Troop informed the squadron commander of the Tiger, and he orders 3rd Troop on a similar Tiger hunt. They swing left into the low ground and come up on the edge of the village to engage the Tiger with their Firefly. The SPGs of H Troop, which are guarding the left flank, would not be well suited for this mission, as their open turrets and lack of coaxial machine guns make them easy targets for enemy infantry in the village. The Shermans of 3rd Troop are still very vulnerable to short-range AT weapons, so the section of carriers that was escorting H Troop joins them to clear a path. With the Tigers destroyed, 3rd Troop goes firm on the left edge of the village, while 4th Troop comes up from reserve and takes the place of 1st Troop, supporting A Company onto the objective. While all this was unfolding on the left, the right push has been advancing steadily through the orchards. The 4 SPGs of G Troop follow in careful bounds with an eye on the open right flank, allowing the tanks of 2nd Troop to focus on supporting the infantry in front. Once inside the orchards, the M10s stay behind the thick hedge as the fields beyond are on an exposed downward slope. As the leading section of M10s goes firm to allow the other section to bound forward, they observe movement in the low ground. What happens next is based on an action by 234 Battery of the 73rd AT Regiment at Wallonde on the 17th of June, when its G-Troop found itself in an almost identical situation. While waiting for snipers to be cleared before further recce, 3 Mark 6 Tigers appeared in line ahead, apparently on the track running north. The first was engaged but increased speed and turned west, quickly disappearing over the crest. The second was engaged by G1 at 800 yards and brewed up at once from a hit apparently on the third ring line. It later blew up. The third stopped and started to reverse. It was engaged by G1 and G2 and a hit scored by G2 at 1000 yards, apparently on the rear end. It moved back out of sight, but large clouds of smoke came up for some time after. The Mark 6 Tiger appears extremely blind, as at no time did they start turning their guns towards us, even after our firing. In our case, a very similar engagement leaves 2 Tigers burning among the grain fields, while the sole survivor has disappeared into the village. Had G-Troop not covered the right flank, these Tigers could have snuck between the tanks of 2nd Troop and the emplaced 17-pounders at the FUP and rolled up the right flank just as the Tiger on the hill was picking off 1st Troop on the left. By now, the sun is setting as A and B Company methodically clear the far edge of the village. Meanwhile, C Company has moved up on the right and is consolidating the orchards in rear of B Company. The remaining tanks occupy defensive positions directly on the objective, using whatever cover and concealment they can find near friendly infantry. The Fireflies train their 17-pounders onto the most likely enemy tank approaches along the roads. On the right, G-Troop lines up its SPGs along the hedge to secure the open flank. On the left, H-Troop covertly enters the village, making sure to stay out of sight of the wooded hill. As soon as all 8 SPGs report that they're set up on their assigned positions, the battery commander confirms the handover and the tanks are cleared to return to the FUP. This area will now serve as their forward rally, where the tanks are replenished by their squadron supply echelon. They are still an active part of the defense, however, and the crews remain alert in case of a German counterattack. As the first 17-pounder shuffle is ongoing, the infantrymen are struggling to get their 6-pounders in position. These were supposed to follow the lead companies during the attack, but the underpowered carriers struggled to keep up with the infantrymen across muddy ground, deep ditches and dense orchards. The anti-tank platoon leader has no way of keeping contact with his dispersed sections, and the detachment commanders are wandering through the shell-torn village in search of their rendezvous points. The infantry platoons are not waiting around, but organize their own anti-tank defense by setting up close-range ambushes with the Piats they carried into battle. Piats alone are insufficient to repulse a well-executed tank attack, however, as was shown when the 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade attacked Verrières Ridge on the 20th of July. A quick counterthrust by German tanks caught the Canadian infantrymen in the open just as they were digging in on their objective. A company commander, caught in the midst of the attack, describes the hopeless situation. The tanks charged from our left rear, continually firing high explosive and machine gun directly at us as they moved in on us. All of this happened in less than a minute. No one had a chance to dig in more than a couple of spades full. The Piat ammunition carrier from 12 platoon had been knocked out already, but I was able to leave the other 2 platoon commanders with their Piat teams. One tank was stopped with 2 rounds and another tank hit without known results. One tank came right into my left forward platoon, driving right over top of people it didn't shoot. I was hollering at the platoon sergeant when the tank fired an HE shell which struck him in the back. He disintegrated into pieces before my eyes. I hollered and used hand signals to order a withdrawal into the cover of the grain field in the direction of D Company, behind which I expected to find the anti-tank screen. As I passed over the crest, I saw 17-pounder anti-tank guns being knocked out. As the first was being towed into position, it was hit by enemy fire and was aflame before it even stopped. On stopping, the crew bailed out and they were all on fire. Our anti-tank platoon officer, Captain Ted Colgate, reported the loss of all 6 6-pounder guns, 4 carriers and 13 personnel. The attached K-Troop 23rd Battery 2nd Anti-Tank Regiment reported their 4 17-pounder guns lost and 7 personnel killed and some missing. We were caught in an open field the moment we arrived at the objective. Enemy tanks came in and rolled right over top of my men. There was no time to dig in. Within minutes our automatic weapons were knocked out and we had no communications of any kind. There was no tank support, no artillery support, and what anti-tank guns we had were knocked out behind us. I will reiterate here that in the final analysis, once our anti-tank guns were knocked out, we had only the infantry weapons we carried with us, while the enemy was able to employ infantry, mortar, artillery and tank guns in their counterattack. In our case, SPGs are securing the objective as the towed guns are slowly brought forward. While this is better than relying on PIATs alone, their high profiles, poor protection and single-purpose armament made SPGs less than ideal for perimeter defense. Sergeant Howell of 234 Battery of the 73rd AT Regiment experienced these downsides shortly after he had positioned his 17-pounder M10 in a hedgerow-lined orchard following the attack on Bois-Lond on the 17th of June. A carrier had dropped off a 6-pounder near him, but to his surprise the crew left the gun unmanned while they went back to retrieve the ammunition, which was probably on an overloaded carrier stuck in a ditch somewhere. Then the following happened. One of my crew called me and pointed out that about 300 or 400 yards ahead, a German kept poking up and looking through binoculars, and sure enough, I could see the German from the waist up with binoculars looking in my direction. And the next thing I saw was a German anti-tank gun with a crew being wheeled out into the open towards me, so I gave orders to my gun layer and told him that as soon as they dropped the trails to open fire. By now the range would only have been perhaps 300 yards. As soon as they dropped the trail, we fired. I could see what I thought was a hit, following the tracer from the shell, but unfortunately I was looking out the top of the turret and my gun layer was looking through the telescope in the turret, and in firing the amount of dust and smoke created a cloud so that my gun layer could no longer see anything at all. And in fact my gun layer then swapped places with another one of my crew who thought he could see the gun having looked over the top of the turret. Now the German AT gun fired at us. Fortunately it missed. By now the cloud had settled a bit and we got another shot off, which again I made to be a hit, and again we were blinded by the blast from our own gun. As it cleared, my gun layer was able to fire again, and this time unmistakably we hit the anti-tank gun quite clearly. About 5 minutes later, we heard the hiss of mortar bombs in the air. One of them landed on the rear of the tank destroyer, setting off the 50 caliber machine gun ammunition. I decided it was foolish to remain in that position, so I gave orders for us to pull back a short distance where I could take cover behind the hedge where I was concealed from whatever was in front. Incidentally, I could look through the tops of the hedge and the orchard in front of it and could still see this German trying to find us again. Soon another mortar strike, which Howell described as the heaviest concentration of fire I have ever been close to, struck their former position at the edge of the orchard. Luckily the fire was very accurate and only hit the vacated spot, not their new position deeper in the orchard. Another M10 of his troop was less fortunate. To quote a report from the lieutenant, about this time the 17-pounder troop, 55th Anti-Tank Regiment Royal Artillery began to arrive. 2 guns were put in, one on either side of the number 1 gun, and must have been spotted, as shortly afterwards a mortar stonk came down, killing one of my men. This action demonstrates the downsides of the M10, combining some of the worst features of both the tank and the towed gun by being both conspicuous and poorly protected. On the other hand, its mobility allowed it to shoot and scoot to avoid the worst of the enemy mortar fire, while its open-top turret increased situational awareness. Most important of all, the SPG was already in a firing position on the objective, while the towed guns were still struggling to get forward. In our case, the tanks report that they've reorganized on the FUP, prompting the towed 17-pounder troop to limber up and head for the objective. The feud artillery tractors are road-bound, but the only road into the village has been thoroughly plowed by tank tracks, cratered by artillery fire and blocked by fallen trees. Sappers are called in to clear the way, but due to a miscommunication, the troop has already moved down the road and comes to a standstill between the hedgerows, unable to turn around. The Germans have meanwhile commenced pre-planned interdiction fires to delay the British consolidation, and the single road into the village is an obvious target. A similar situation unfolded along the hedgerow-lined roads leading to Landet in Normandy. To quote a report on the action, as the commanding officer and his gunner and sapper advisors approached the wood to the northwest of the start line in carriers and scout cars, they were greeted by a series of heavy German artillery concentrations. They left their vehicles in a hurry and jumped into some old enemy weapon pits and decided to establish a command post there. The enemy shelling now increased in intensity, particularly in the neighborhood of the command post. The first sapper party, moving up to clear a route forward for the anti-tank guns, was completely knocked out by this fire and had to be entirely replaced. The sapper officer then arrived with the somewhat disquieting news that the clearing of the route was going to be a bigger task than had been expected. A bulldozer would probably be required, and the work would take at least 3 hours. Panthers had already been reported on the roads from Vendes and Landet, making it all the more essential to get the anti-tank guns forward as quickly as possible. Luckily, only a small counterattack, supported by 2 Panthers, materialized shortly before last light, and a direct hit from a Piat scared off both tanks. But it would take another 5 hours before all anti-tank guns were finally in position. In our case, the towed 17-pounders have been caught in the interdiction fire, and one of the unarmored tractors is knocked out by splinters and some casualties are suffered. Fortunately, the Germans are firing blind and seize the barrage before the rest of the column is wiped out. A benefit of a towed gun over a self-propelled one is that a destroyed vehicle does not equal a knocked-out gun. It was Royal Artillery policy that an SPG should be able to tow a gun of its own caliber, so one of G Troop's M10s is dispatched to hook up the stranded 17-pounder and bring it to its firing position. Another benefit of the towed gun is that its crew of 7 can take some casualties and still remain combat capable. By now it's completely dark, which complicates the sighting of the guns, but makes them less likely to be spotted before they are dug in and camouflaged. The leader of the infantry 6-pounder platoon takes over command of the local anti-tank defenses and together with the 17-pounder troop leader inspects the sighting of the guns, establishes secondary positions, and coordinates with nearby infantry defenses. The 17-pounders are sighted slightly behind the 6-pounders as a backstop, letting the smaller guns hold the outer perimeter while the big guns fulfill a counter-penetration role. Meanwhile, the infantry sappers are laying anti-tank mines along the approaches. With all the towed guns in position and responsibility for the defense handed over, the SPGs start their engines and rumble out of the village towards the FUP, where they relieve the tanks. With the second 17-pounder shuffle complete, the SPGs now form the local anti-tank reserve, freeing the tanks to fully disengage and prepare for the next attack. Perhaps tomorrow an action will be ordered to seize the village on the right, and the tactic will be repeated in support of another infantry battalion. Or a German counterattack may threaten the recently established defenses. In that case, the 17-pounder shuffle will essentially be performed in reverse. First, the SPGs will move up from reserve to reinforce the emplaced guns at the front. Then the tanks will counterattack to drive the Germans back and regain any lost ground. In both offense and defense, surprise is the key to successful anti-tank tactics, and surprise is best achieved through a combination of maneuver and concealment that makes the best possible use of all available armor-piercing weapons, be they towed, self-propelled or tank-mounted. The official history of British artillery tactics and equipment states that by early 1943, the restoration of the gun to its earlier position of importance upon the battlefield had been finally assured. With the 6-pounder now available in adequate numbers and the 17-pounder beginning to make its appearance, the tank had been mastered. It was not, of course, the final victory. That would have to be won by the Sherman and its successors, but it was the foundation on which a successful offensive could be based. When this offensive was launched on the shores of Normandy, the anti-tank tactics that had been honed in North Africa proved successful. British forces not only took ground and held it against fierce opposition, but systematically destroyed German armor, including advanced models that outclassed Allied tank designs. When British anti-tank defenses failed, it was usually due to a misapplication of tactics, not a fundamental flaw in doctrine. The opposite was true on the German side, where immediate local counter-thrusts, based on Eastern Front experience, had been ingrained into German tank commanders. When they tried their shock tactics on the British, they ran into a moving wall of anti-tank guns, manned by troops drilled to expect these counter-thrusts at all times. Arguably the greatest tactical challenge facing the British in Normandy was not defending against German tank attacks, but overcoming the limited offensive capability of their own anti-tank equipment. First off, the infantry was not self-sufficient in anti-tank firepower. Man-portable weapons like the Piat were too short range, whereas towed 6-pounders weren't mobile enough to provide close support in the attack. Worst of all, both lacked the punch to knock out the latest German tanks head-on. More powerful guns were needed, but these ran into the practical limits of the towed configuration, as increases in firepower demanded ever larger guns that were difficult to move and conceal, and thus easily spotted and neutralized. This dead end was reached with the 17-pounder, according to one AT regiment, describing its towed configuration as quite useless and a SP gun is infinitely preferable. However, the problem with the only SPG available during the Normandy campaign was that the stopgap M10 shared many downsides of the tank it was based on, most damningly its conspicuous size, without offering much in return now that actual tanks had been upgunned with the 17-pounder. The M10's combination of size and weak protection made it an especially poor choice for consolidating an objective. This was quickly recognized in Normandy, where mortars took a heavy toll on exposed SPG crews. Returning to the 73rd AT Regiment one last time, its combat evaluation of the M10 noted that the task of AT protection in the consolidating period was always given in the desert to tanks. Their heavier armor and consequent immunity from small arms and mortar fire make them far more suitable for this purpose. This brings us to the final and arguably greatest flaw in equipment, that the heavier armor of the 17-pounder tanks made little practical difference on the 1944 battlefield, leaving them just as vulnerable as the SPGs to anything heavier than small arms and mortar fire. As the official history made clear, the burden of the offensive would fall on the tanks, not the guns. SPGs could make do with poor protection, provided they were used defensively as intended. But tanks had to go on the attack, and this not only demanded firepower and mobility, but also a sufficient level of protection, and this the 17-pounder tanks did not have. Working around the flaws of your equipment requires good tactics. By making the best possible use of all available 17-pounders within the combined arms team, British equipped and trained forces overcame one of the war's greatest tactical challenges by successfully advancing in the face of superior enemy armor. This has been Ivo van der Spoel, and thank you for watching Digital Battlefield Tours.